Good evening, welcome. I'm John. I'm a bookseller at Literati Bookstore in downtown Ann Arbor, Michigan. We're so pleased to welcome Edward Hirsch in support of the heart of American poetry and conversation this evening with Charles Baxter. Just a quick webinar overview for our attendees. The chat is closed this evening, but you can keep the chat window open. I'll be sharing links to purchase the book from Literati throughout the event. The Q&A is available to you. Please feel free to enter any questions you have throughout the event into the Q&A, and I'll read a selection of those questions on your behalf at the conclusion of the conversation. Live transcription is also available to you on your toolbar, should you need it. And if you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You'll also see in the lower right-hand corner of your screen a little typewriter button where you can subscribe to our channel and be kept up to date with all of our At Home with Literati events once they become available on our channel. And as a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com that have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And if you live in Southeast Michigan or the Ann Arbor area, our doors are open to the public for in-store shopping. But most of all, we would just like to thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, or much later in the evening, depending on where and when in the world you may be joining us. So without further ado, I will introduce tonight's author and our moderator. Edward Hirsch is a celebrated poet and champion for poetry. He is the author of 10 books of poems and 6 books of prose and has received numerous awards and fellowships, including a MacArthur Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Arts Fellowship, the Rome Prize, Pablo Neruda Presidential Medal of Honor, and the Academy of American Arts and Letters Award for Literature. He serves as president of the John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation and lives in Brooklyn. Joining him, Charles Baxter is the author of 14 books, most recently the novel The Sun Collective. His stories have appeared in the Best American Short Stories, the Pushcart Prize Anthology, and the O. Henry Prize Story Anthology. He lives in Minneapolis. Please join me in welcoming Edward Hirsch and Charles Baxter into your living rooms.
Thank you, John. I think it's worth telling the audience that Edward Hirsch and I have known each other for, I don't know how long it is, Eddie. It's something like 40 years.
40, I think so. It's about 40 years or more.
That we were young teachers, young professors together at Wayne State University in Detroit in the 70s. And the segue is that part of my pleasure in reading the heart of American poetry brought back the time when Eddie and I were trading back and forth the discoveries of various poets we were reading and whose work we loved and were in a sense selling to each other. I think you always had read more than I had, but the pleasure of discovery, I think, is always part of the reading of poetry, the reading of literature. So I think one place that might be good for us to start is to talk a bit about what the shape of this book is and what your ambitions were for it. As I was reading it, I thought, I have never quite read a book exactly like this before, because I think that in part, this is an anthology, but it is also a set of readings, both thematic and formal. The book is a kind of cultural history of American life. And it's also, in an interesting way, it's a reader's autobiography, because many of the readings of the poems involve your telling us where you first read these poems and the kind of effect that they had on you. I'll just add to say that I think that the book includes poems that many of us are familiar with, and very interesting readings of those familiar poems, and poems that many of us have probably never encountered before. So I think maybe my leadoff question was, how did you envision this book? What were your ambitions with it? I know that's a big question, but I'm sure you can go with it.
Charlie, I've loved talking to you for as long as I've known you. So it's just, I'm so glad you're here with me.
Yeah.
I mean, one of the great charms of my life was when we were in that horrible place in State Hall and I could just come down the hall and bother you during lunch and we could talk about poetry. So let's just keep on doing what we're doing. So anyway, very glad to be with you all. This book changed. First of all, the book was commissioned by the Library of America for its 40th anniversary. And they came to me before the pandemic to write a book about 40 American poems. And I knew immediately that you couldn't write the same book now that you'd write in 1970 or 1950 or 1890. It would always, but I thought the most difficult thing I would have to do would be figure out what poems to choose. And they started giving me lists. And I wrote a couple pieces, and we soon realized that I shouldn't just follow the prescribed list of what some committee came up with, that I should write a personal book and that I needed to care about the poems. And so the poets became, the poems were like, they're not the greatest 40 poets in America, and they're not the greatest 40 poems. They're 40 poems and 40 poets that I really care about. And sometimes the choice is canonical, like the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock or Sunday Morning. Sometimes it goes way off the grid, like Robert Johnson's Crosstown Blues, or no one's heard of Julia de Burgos, Puerto Rican Independent.
I love the inclusion of that poem. I want to talk about it.
Yeah, but I wanted to say, since you asked me, that the pandemic gave me the time and the inclination to rethink what I thought this book was. And I thought it was going to be 40 essays, and then I decided I did not want to do it. And during the pandemic, I was living in Atlanta with my partner, and I didn't have my library. And that seemed like a torment at first. And then I decided to choose to make it an opportunity, because I decided to make it a partial autobiography. And one of the greatest pleasures in writing it was remembering just what you described, where I was when I first read a poem and when I first thought about a poet. And many of the pieces are conversion narratives. That is, I thought something, I was off, I underestimated a poet. Someone taught me something, someone said something, I read something that led me to believe that there was something deeper in it than I had realized, and I sort of reconceptualized my idea. And I decided to leave those mistakes in, and to leave those misreadings in, and those misconceptions in, because I thought they'd be interesting and more interesting to a reader. But the main thing I guess I'd want to say is I decided to think seriously. Why wait? No time like now. Gotta weigh in now, can't wait. What did I think about American poetry? And what was the project of a poetry of democracy? And had people thought seriously about this? And I decided to write a book in the light of three viruses. COVID-19, that had shut down the entire world. The reemergence of racism, both individual and systemic, that shocked all of us. I mean, we knew it was there, but it was so vicious. And that's what led to Black Lives Matter. And finally, an authoritarian threat to democracy that I hadn't anticipated, and that so many people in America didn't seem to believe in democracy. Right. I was very disheartened, like everyone. And I just thought, well, what can I do? Well, I can think seriously about what a poetry of democracy looks like and what differentiates American poetry from all the other poetries as part of my education in life. And so the 40 poems, choosing them was hard, and what I wrote about was a challenge, but I wanted to have a through line. And the through line was, what distinguishes our poetry? How is our poetry self-correcting? What is the ideal that drives American culture? And how does that infuse American poetry? And that's the The premise is that all persons are created equal, and that we don't live up to that promise very often. But our poets keep holding us to it and keep putting our feet to the fire around this. And so as I march through all of American poetry, choosing 40 poets, I keep this in mind: is what is the poetry of democracy? How does it work? And how do these individual poets contribute to the larger project? And as you know, I keep finding that American poets and American culture keeps saying it's a culture of self-reliance. And yet how often do people use the word we?
Right, right. You know, one of the things that I was thinking about as I read through your book was the anthology that affected both you and me when we were youngsters, Hayden Carruth's The Voice That Is Great Within Us. It's a quotation from Stevens, isn't it? From Wallace Stevens.
It's from Evening Without Angels.
Yeah, and that anthology was a mass market paperback. I think it cost something like $4.95. And its ambitions were different from the book that you've put together. It was an anthology of 400 or 500 pages. The poems were just there with very brief introductions. And, you know, the title of the anthology was wonderful, The Voice That Is Great Within Us, but the word us is kind of unexamined because we weren't thinking about who is us in those days. And that's a mistake that I don't think that your book makes. The question of communities and different communities is very much a part of what you've put together here. I guess I'll lay my cards on the table. It seemed to me that one of the things that this book does, particularly for people who, let's say, in some ways, my ideal reader for your book is someone who's a little scared of poetry, hasn't read that much of it, but feels that there's something there to gain from. And entering your book, I think that reader feels welcome. No matter what the person's ethnic background or whether he's rich or poor, there's a little something that addresses a reader like that. And well, I have more to say about this, but do you
Yeah, because we were that reader.
We were that reader, sure.
We were that reader.
Every reader starts as that reader.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know anything. And, you know, you and I mean, as my book begins with going into B. Dalton, trying to find out something about American poetry, because I'm writing poetry, I don't know anything about it. I go, well, I'm an American poet, I ought to learn something about it. I go into B. Dalton, they don't have any books. It's like practically, you know, bookstore without books. They were ahead of their time there. And so I find this mass market thing and I go, oh, the voice that is great within us. Holy shit. Yeah. I mean, and then, you know, the promise there of Stevens, which I hold us to in the book and take it seriously, is different than what Stevens meant. But when he says the voice that is great within us, he doesn't say the voice that is great within me. He says the voice that is great within us. Exactly. So let's take it seriously. Let's take it seriously. Who's the us? And American poetry is self-correcting because you said the voice that's great within us. So you haven't included me in that us. I belong too. And you know, the inclusion, just the communities who are left out, there have been systematically excluded. A poet comes along and makes room as part of the us. Yeah. But what's important to me is also this idea of American poetry and in fact, American culture as a family. Yeah. A sometimes dysfunctional family. My sister laughed hilariously when I said it's a family that gathers at Thanksgiving, and sometimes people go storming off in different directions. She goes, wonder where you got that idea. So, but I mean, the idea is, okay, you say the voice is great within us, who's us? So I'm part of the us, I'm included too. When the key moment for me in understanding this is when Langston Hughes says, I am the darker brother. He doesn't say, I'm your enemy. He doesn't say, I don't have anything to do with you. He goes, I'm your darker brother in the poem, I Too. And it's a correction of Whitman. It's a correction of I Hear America Singing, going, well, have I been included in America Singing? I too belong here. I too sing America, and I too am America. So you may not like it, but you have to make room at the table. But that suggests what Michael Harper calls images of kin, that we are related, even if you don't like it. And so the voice has to be great within us. The table has to be widened. Everyone has to be invited in. And I'm trying to speak in this book to both, I think what you're picking up is both initiated and uninitiated readers. It has to be accurate for the initiate, but I didn't want to write a book for them. I mean, I wanted it to be right for everyone who wants to study these poets, and it has to be accurate. But that's not who I'm trying to invite in. Recently, someone did an interview with me in the Chicago Tribune, and he said, don't poets just speak to people who are already in the room? And I said, if they do, it's not my fault. I'm trying to talk to people who are not in the room, as you know.
I think the book is working very hard to overcome the kind of phobia that people sometimes feel about poetry, that it's not for them and that it doesn't have anything to say to them. How I think I felt welcomed into the world of poetry when I was in high school, and my brother brought home a book of poems by James Wright, The Branch Will Not Break. And one of the poems from that book is in The Heart of American Poetry. It's kind of a famous poem now, Autumn Begins, in Martins Ferry, Ohio. Sometimes all it takes is one poem. All it takes is one poem to knock your socks off and to win you over to what this form is and what it can do.
Well, you were ahead of me, as always, because you were in high school and I was in college. But I talked about when I first encountered that poem, and I was back in the bookstore again, looking for stuff. And I was playing college football, and I was trying to write poetry, and those were completely separate worlds. And then I encountered James Wright and read the poem Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio. And my two worlds collided. And in fact, two different kinds of masculinity collided. I liked what I said about it. I have to say, I said it was a clean hit.
It's good. We should explain for people who may have tuned in and don't know that James Wright's poem, Autumn Begins in Martins Ferry, Ohio, is about high school football. And it's about the speaker sitting in the stands, watching a football game, a high school football game, and thinking about what it means.
There's not much about the game.
Not much about the game. No, there's
true. A lot of thinking.
Yeah. Something I want to say about your book, I have all these notes that I've taken on it, is that, and it surprised me a little bit, is that the book illustrates a kind of division in American culture that has been part of us for a long time. On the one hand, there are great, great poems in this book that are concerned with what I'd call the solitary experience, isolation, loneliness, meditation, making a world from a kind of solitary point of view. But there's another kind of poem in the book, very often written by people of color, that has to do with communities and where a person exists within a community. And I don't know if you want to talk about that at all.
I think it's a super interesting subject, but what I'm against is prescription. I mean, what I'm against is saying poets can't write about social issues.
Oh, right.
Or the opposite, poets have to write about social issues. And so I'm sort of trying to make the case that in American poetry, we make room for the eccentric individual viewpoint, and that American poetry is vastly enriched by an Emily Dickinson. And at the same time, we make space for the thinking about the collective and the communal, and that American poetry is this sort of spectrum. And that on the one hand, you have the high lyrical, someone like Louise Glick, or C.K. Williams, who's thinking about the emergence of his own voice himself. And on the other, you have What Happens to a Dream Deferred.
Right.
And you have the new Colossus and Emily Dickinson and Emma Lazarus thinking about immigrants coming into the United States and what it means.
Yeah. When we were talking about this before, I said that there are poems in this book that I've loved all my adult life and that I would love to talk to you about. Edwin Arlington Robinson's Eros Tyrannos is one of them. But there are poems also that I have recently discovered thanks to this book. One of them is Julia de Burgos, Farewell to Welfare Island. I'd never read this before. Maybe a lot of readers of poetry have, but it was absolutely new to me. I also loved the courage, and I thought the rightness of including Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues. It's impossible to imagine an anthology of poetry from 60 years ago, including that poem.
I mean, I'm really proud of those two pieces. And the Crosstown Blues, I mean, I'm really stretching there because Crossroad Blues, because I'm not a music critic. And so you have to think about how the blues work interacting with the music works with the lyrics. But I believe it's really important to include the blues tradition as part of American poetry, and in the expansion there and the movement from poetry into song. I worked really hard on thinking hard and got help there to help me think through how the music and the lyrics were interacting. But the lyrics are great.
Yeah. You got Ry Cooder to help you.
Yeah, that was really funny. That was really funny.
How did you do that?
I called Alec Wilkinson, who was our friend, and he knows about music. And I asked him, I said, I'm writing about the Mississippi Blues. I don't know enough. And can you help me? He goes, I can't, but Ry Cooder knows all about this. And I go, I can't call Ry Cooder. He goes, yeah, actually, it's the pandemic. He's just at home playing guitar. But you got to get through the first few minutes, because when you ask Ry Cooder if he knows anything about music, he says no. So I called him up just out of the blue. He said, yeah, I heard about you. I go, yeah, I'm writing about Crossroad Blues and I'm trying to write about the Mississippi Delta Blues. He goes, yeah, I don't know anything about that. So I go, yeah, okay, but can I ask you a question? At Robert Johnson's recording, he went to the corner and started recording in the corner in the hotel room. And people said he was hiding they didn't want people to steal his licks. He goes, oh, that's so stupid. He goes, yeah, he was corner loading. He was getting the reverb effect off the room. I mean, in 1936, in the hotel room that he was in Texas, and he knew everything. He knew everything about the recording session. So I was just writing it down. And then, and so I just kept asking him questions like, why do you tune in a certain chord? He goes, yeah, I don't. Oh yeah, well, Mississippi Blues always do that. And so he just answered. I mean, I didn't ask him about the lyrics.
Yeah.
I just asked him about the music, but it really helped me think about it. But it was because of that.
Yeah.
So I was really excited about writing about that and about the blues as an accentual form of poetry.
Yeah.
Julia de Burgos is the person that really she's left out of all our literary anthologies, And no one's really heard of her except in Puerto Rican communities. Like if you walk up to the Bronx, you can find a Julia de Burgos Cultural Center. You can see Julia de Burgos School. You can see Julia de Burgos murals. I mean, she's a famous person in Puerto Rico. But because she writes in Spanish, most people didn't think of her as the American pantheon. So my argument is she's not considered part of American poetry, even though she lived most of her life in New York. And I said, well, when we imposed the Jones Act on Puerto Rico so we could conscript young men into the military, we made Puerto Ricans American citizens. We also made Puerto Rican poetry part of American poetry unintentionally. Right. And so I see her, we all know this now, for example, through the Neo-Rican movement. But I'm going long before the Neo-Rican movement, looming up behind her, way behind that was a tremendous Puerto Rican independista, Julia de Burgos. Now, in 100 Poems to Break Your Heart, I wrote about her poem River de Grande, which is a little more in her wheelhouse. I write about Farewell and Welfare Island because it's one of the 2 poems she wrote in English. And I just felt really much more comfortable writing about a poem in English than in Spanish. But it's also super interesting as an issue of her crossing over and what it meant to write a kind of deathbed poem in English. So I was very excited to write that, though I have to say, I think my introduction to that piece is probably the weirdest of all my.
Why do you say that?
Because if you remember, I write about I'm going to pick up Garcia Lorca at his hotel. It is
weird. That part is weird. I agree.
He's it's like, so Garcia Lorca lived in New York in 1929, and Julia de Burgos, wrote in New York in 1950. And I'm writing now, and I'm saying I'm going to pick up Garcia Lorca at his dorm, and we're going to go meet Julia de Burgos because she loves his work. And I'm telling him all about her, even though he doesn't really speak English because he was pretending that he did. But she knows both languages. And then we get up to the Bronx, and my dream dissolves, and it's a kind of fantasy. And then that I've had that 3 poets could meet. And then I sort of pull a Borgesian move, something I really got from Borges, that you can imagine, maybe there's a world where you can imagine that 3 poets from different time periods stood together on a corner and talked about poetry. So I mean, that's I guess it's the bit, what I mean is by weirdest is it's a fantasia.
Yeah. That poem and her work as a poet made me think also of Emma Lazarus. When I was teaching at Michigan, I had a colleague, George Bornstein. I don't know if you knew George.
I do, yeah.
But
you introduced me to him.
I did? Oh,
yeah.
I probably did. He was fascinated by Emma Lazarus, and those of the people who have tuned into this probably know that she wrote a poem in which appears the phrase, "Give me, you're tired, you're poor," and so on. But that's part of a longer poem, and she was a sonneteer. Not everybody knows that she wrote, I think they were Petrarchan sonnets, weren't they?
Yeah.
And she was a formidable poet.
Those are the 2 most famous lines in American poetry. Give me, you're tired, you're poor, you're huddled masses yearning to be free. But the poem that they're part of is kind of underread.
Yeah. Nobody knows. I had probably read the first 6 lines, but I couldn't remember them when I got to your explanation, when I got to your.
So that's a case where it was really exciting to return to it because the lines are famous, but when you read them in the context, they're really charged, and the whole poem is really interesting and really radical. And she's a really much surprising poet. And so I was excited to sort of make the case for like these famous lines are part of a poem that's actually underread, not understood. And there's a kind of tremendous argument for the New World right there, for the Statue of Liberty right there in that poem, because it begins not like the Colossus of old. I just wanted to hug her right there.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you, Emma Lazarus.
Yeah.
Like, because you are rejecting the imperial power of Greece and Rhodes right there. There's the movement right there. It begins. It's really radical to begin a poem not like.
Right.
And so I try to read that and go, well, what's it not like? And what's she replacing with? And so she's taking this, masculine power of Rhodes, this 20-foot high or 40-foot or 80-foot high statue of Rhodes, and she's replacing it with a welcoming female presence.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's really something.
Yeah. Yeah. Something else, I hope this doesn't surprise you, but I thought we're being sponsored this evening by Literati, which is in downtown Ann Arbor. And that made me think of Michigan and Ann Arbor. And I thought, are there poems in this book that were written or came from poets who lived in Ann Arbor? And that made me think of Robert Hayden, whom I knew a little. The greatest poet ever to live in Burns Park in Ann Arbor. And in fact, I don't know if I ever told you this. I think I was still teaching at Wayne State. James Wright came to give a reading at Michigan. It was in the student union. And Robert Hayden was sitting in the third row. And somebody, it may have been Larry Goldstein, it may have been Donald Hall, introduced James Wright. And Wright didn't know that Hayden was in the audience. And Wright got up and he was about to start his reading when he looked out and he saw Robert Hayden and he just stopped. And he took the book, his own book, and he walked down the aisle. He walked over to Robert Hayden and said, "Would you please sign my book?" And then Wright went back to the front of the room and he started reciting from memory poems by Robert Hayden, including the poem that everybody knows now, Those Winter Sundays. It was incredibly moving. It was just incredibly moving. And Wright, I'm sorry, this is your show. I don't mean
I remember an interview in which Wright points out the use of the word offices.
Offices. He said the word offices is the great word in that poem, which indeed it is. I don't know. It seems to me Middle Passage is simply one of the great American poems. And I was so pleased to see it in this book and your commentary on it. And, here we are in Ann Arbor.
It was a big thing to take on.
Yeah.
Those Winter Sundays is a great poem, but I felt it had been read pretty closely by
everybody knows it now.
And it's a great poem, but everybody knows it. And I mean, my essay begins with how unfair I thought it was when Robert Hayden was canceled by the Black Arts Movement.
Right.
And that was happening when you and I were coming up in poetry because of Baraka and what happened to him at Fisk. And even though I'm an outsider to that argument, as a white person, I felt it was unfair. And now the wheel is swung around.
Oh, I think so.
But at the time it wasn't, largely because of Michael Harper and what he did for Robert Hayden. But I believed, I was just reading Robert Hayden on my own, and I believed he was a great African-American poet who had also written about large subjects about freedom. He didn't just write a group of personal poems about people in Paradise Valley. And so I wanted to take on this big rewrite of the wasteland in Middle Passage. And it's a kind of epic poem. And it was an epic poem that he wrote when people didn't really want to talk about slavery as a subject. He was really early in bringing up and writing this poem, which is a collage, and he had to teach himself how to do it. So people don't think of him as much as an experimental poet as I think he was, and as he shows, because he had to come up with a whole new means of writing of writing a poem around collage. But as a result, it's also an answer to Pound and Eliot. Yeah. And it's a revision of their subject matter and their way of thinking. It uses the method that they imported and made up to turn it against the racism of Anglo-American modernism, which you and I have talked about a lot, which was sort of baked into the subject. So I was really excited. I was nervous to write about this poem because it's such a long poem and it's in such detail, and I'm an outsider. But I believe it's a great poem, and I really wanted to make the case for it as an argument at the heart of American poetry for the quest for freedom.
Yeah, no, I think you made a wonderful case for it. And, you know, as long as we're talking about Michigan, was Frank O'Hara, who was a student there.
Yeah,
and
he won a Hopwood.
He won a Hopwood, that's right. And Theodore Retki, whose home in Saginaw, you drove up to see, and I had driven up to see 4 years before. I've got to say, Eddie, as a longtime friend of yours, I've got to ask, why did you choose Retki's poems cuttings? They're not the poems I would have chosen. I mean, they're good poems, but I wouldn't have chosen them.
No, I mean, maybe the North American sequence is the bigger Whitmanian project. I wanted to write about the greenhouse poems, and cuttings just seemed the way in.
Yeah.
So it was basically a vehicle.
Yeah.
They wouldn't let me write about all of them. I said I wanted to treat them all as one poem, as a sequence. Yeah. And they said, yeah, that's stretching it. Yeah. Plus, we can't afford it. I felt here, really what happens, I think here, I read the poem really about as closely as you can, but they're really short. Yeah. And I really use them as a vehicle to talk about what the larger Retki project is, about digging down in the dirt and going back into the unconscious. Yeah. And a lot of those longer poems, especially in the middle, they're just too unwieldy to write about in a single book. They're just too long.
Yeah, I get it.
It was a practical decision, really.
Yeah. And you know, if you read your book sequentially, it's interesting. You read William Carlos Williams on the Road to the Contagious Hospital, which ends with the image of a plant taking root. And then, you know, you read about 100 pages later, the Retki poem, in which there's a very similar action. I was also surprised and pleased to discover the Muriel Rukhizer poem about the cockroach.
Yeah, it's really funny, isn't it? Yeah.
That's a poem that you could take into a classroom and you could say to the students, how many of you think you could write a great poem about a cockroach? And if anybody raises their hand in the air, it would surprise me. Yeah. Even though we've all seen cockroaches, there it is. And it's a kind of amazing poem.
Well, but that's the point of the poem is,
Right.
Saint Cockroach. I mean, she
Yeah.
takes the most despised. Again, I don't think it's her greatest poem, but she takes this despised creature
Yeah.
and does so much with it that it just is.
Right.
It's just remarkable, and it centers her vision, I think, because she's in a. One thing about the context of that poem is she wrote it in a jail cell after being arrested for another protest against the Vietnam War.
Yeah.
And she'd never really looked at a cockroach before. Suddenly
Yeah.
she was keeping
Yeah.
company.
Yeah. Eddie, the people in the audience who have been listening to us might be interested to know what you felt the hardest, either what the hardest poems to write about in this book were, or what you felt the greatest challenge was for you in putting this book together. Nobody is interested in what's easy. People are really interested in what's hard, the things that you had to struggle with.
Well, I mean, one difficulty is some of the poems you're taking on, there's a ton written about them already.
Yeah.
And so you're taking on Wallace Stevens' Sunday Morning.
And Prufrock, Eliot's Prufrock is here.
Yeah, so I didn't want to write an essay that rehearsed what other people said. And so I had to figure out, did I have anything individual to say about these poems? And so I really had to read them really closely and just keep thinking. I didn't have my book, so I just kept thinking, what do I think? What do I think? What is this work? What do I? And then sometimes I came up with wacky stuff. And sometimes I felt very happy bringing in how many comics like Prufrock and how many comedians have made so much fun with what Eliot called the Prufrock complex. And so I was sort of started having fun with all of that. But that was really a challenge to do you actually have enough to say about this poem that's unique, that's distinctive as you do it? And finally, I felt confident about it. You're very aware in America right now when you're writing a poem about people in a community that's not your own. It's just a reality. Some people don't think you should even do it.
Yeah.
Some people feel it's like hands off, like you shouldn't try to do it.
Yeah.
And I just felt that's not right. I have to brave this, but these are sensitive issues. Especially when you're, say, for example, writing about Black vernacular. And as you know, my story about Sterling Brown begins with our days at Wayne.
With Alvin Aubert.
And Alvin Aubert and him sort of gently giving me a kind of corrective the way he did. And that's the wind up to that poem, Sterling Brown, is a little longer than the wind up in some of the others. But I needed it in order to enter into a conversation that is not my conversation, but is an extremely, in my opinion, important conversation to have about American poetry, which is the use of Black vernacular.
Right.
And I'd learned a lot about that, and so I wanted to include it. But I was nervous about this issue, and I felt bad for John Barrowman, but he kind of messed up seriously in the way he used Black vernacular.
Right. I also thought when I came to the end of the book, there are, I think, 3 living poets: Garrett Hongo, Louise Glick, and Joy Harjo. I don't know whether you felt it was any harder to write about them or whether it was just part of the same project that you had been engaged in. Many of these poets are poets who are no longer with us, but whom you and I have known.
I mean, there's a lot, you heard James Wright Reed, but there's, C.K. Williams, who was a friend, Phil Levine, who was a friend.
Yeah.
There's Rukhizer. I mean, I begin with going to a Muriel Rukhizer reading. I knew
Yeah.
Denise Levertov. I knew a lot of these people, but they died on us.
Yeah. I never knew that story about Muriel Rukhizer and the reading that she gave.
Incredible, right?
Yeah.
How she fainted. I mean, how she
fainted.
collapsed.
Yeah.
Kept reading.
I did that once. I passed
Really?
out. You know this. I passed out during a reading once. It's not a pretty picture when somebody does it.
It's an incredible story of her reading because she insisted on continuing. It's an amazing story and something I never thought I'd see, but it worked out to be fit perfectly because her poem Saint Roch is a revision of Christopher Smart's poem Jubilate Agno. And
absolutely.
A passage in Smart, and she was reading out of Jubilate Agno. So I would say that about the three things were difficult to write about. One, Louise Glick, because she's so disapproving. And and she's a friend of ours. So that was a bit, she doesn't like much. So I was nervous about that, but what the hell, I just wanted to. And I mean, I thought it was funny and interesting to write about her taking the perspective of God, as she does in the poem, and try then think seriously about what an oracular poetry looks like.
Mm-hmm.
The Garrett Hongo I thought long and hard about, because I really don't think there's another essay like this. It's way out of bounds in what academics do, because I'm writing about a poem that's dedicated to me. And I'm actually a figure in the poem because it's a poem called Ancestral Graves Kahuku, in which Garrett goes to his ancestral graveyard in Hawaii, and I'm a passenger in the car with him, and he's telling me the story of his ancestral graveyard. But the story seems to me so important, not just to him, but to American poetry and to American culture.
Yeah. If I could interject for a minute, by the time I got to Garrett's poem, I thought this fits perfectly into this book. And the reason that it does is that one of the questions that this book keeps asking through the selection of the poems that are presented and the essays that you write to accompany them is the question that many Americans ask, which is, where do I belong? What part of this land can I claim as mine? But I think more particularly, it's where do I belong? Where do I go? And that poem is completely about that question.
That's what I thought too. That's why I decided it was so important, because he tells the story and suddenly you've got the story of the Japanese coming to Hawaii and the Hawaiians coming to California, and what that and the intermixing of races there, and what the ancestral story is, and how a group of people like African Americans, now called generally Asian Americans, but in his case, Japanese Americans through generations, become American, and how that becomes part of the American story and the American narrative in poetry. So it's like another version of like how, and so even though it's the most personal, by then I've been making the case, I believe, all along, because I'm so present all through the book, because the book is so much of a partial autobiography because the introduction is called Education of a Poet. I don't think it's as jarring as it might have been early on. And then I hope it's not anyway. And the Joy Harjo, I wanted to save to the end. There could have been younger poets and other poets that I could have included, but I purposely chose a poem that had to do with a very explicit ancient Native American story, because I begin with the Native American presence in the United States for tens of thousands of years here. And I begin the book by arguing that those oral tales, stories, and songs poems are part of the American narrative that have been left out and excluded from our thinking about American culture and American poetry, particularly. It didn't just start with the Puritans. Right. So because of that, I mean, thank you, Joy Harjo, when she writes a poem about Rabbit, and the stories about Rabbit go back, thousands and thousands of years, I just couldn't resist. So I don't think it's even her greatest poem, but it was give me a chance to bring those arguments about and those stories about Rabbit in. And then on top of it, because of my folklore studies, I knew how Rabbit had also been a figure in African-American folklore.
Yeah.
And how important that was in the 19th century. So
a trickster figure.
It helped me to weave the tale.
Yeah, that essay was one of the few in which your background as a folklorist.
Yeah, finally
becomes evident.
Crossroad Blue, the Robert Johnson and Joy Harjo is like, finally that education paid off. I've been waiting all these years to be able to use it.
Yeah. After reading your book, I thought, maybe I should take down from my shelf some of the anthologies like the Oxford Book of American Verse, edited by F.O. Matheson. And I read the introduction, and Matheson says that when he put the book together, he gave himself 4 rules. One was avoid sonnets. He didn't like sonnets. Try to be inclusive, which meant in 1950, including poets like Philip Freneau and Jones Very. But he said that the greatest rule for him in putting together this anthology was don't include poems you don't like.
Yeah.
And because I know you, I was looking through this selection and thinking, where is Eddie's enthusiasm going to flag? And I think I know.
Yeah.
I'm not sure I will say, but
okay.
but here and there, I think I note some reservations that you have, but for the most part, I think the book is as any book like this has to be a tremendous act of generosity. If as a critic, if you're not going to be generous, and both to the poems and to the audience, why are you doing it? I mean, there's no point in engaging in a project like this unless, in effect, you're on a street corner and you're saying to the people who are passing by, these are wonderful poems. They've changed my life. If you want to read some information about them, I have some things to say. I don't think in a book like this that you have to read the commentaries.
No,
it's
you
a
can
little,
read you can read it out of order. You can read the poems.
Yeah.
And you can also read the book out of order because they're individual essays.
Yeah.
But I'm glad you brought up Matheson because although that anthology is flawed, I love his book, American Renaissance.
Mm-hmm.
And
It's a great book.
I had it in mind when I was writing my book. And I also had Alfred Kazin in mind and some of those books that we read when we were in college. But the thing that you just said is very important, but I want to highlight the fact that it goes against the grain of 30 years of academic criticism, because you and I came up reading books that are extremely suspicious.
Yes, the aesthetics of suspicion. We know.
Suspicious reading was and still is the dominant mode of reading in English departments. And you and I spent our lives in English departments. So, and we learned a lot from all of those. But a lot of those readings are takedowns, and they're meant to be that. And they're looking to convict. and to find the contradictions in the text. And I wanted to return to another kind of criticism that was more generous that I found in American Renaissance, which turned me on to the fact that between 1850 and 1855, 5 American writers became great American writers in a 5-year period. It's mind-boggling.
Right.
So I wanted to return to that spirit of something more generous and larger to make the case, both about the individual poets, but also because I believe that poetry itself, American poetry itself, is an underutilized resource in larger American culture.
Yeah. I think that's right. And I'll just add that I'm pretty well read, I think, in that area, but either I had read Melville's poem, Shiloh, and forgotten it, or maybe I hadn't read that poem, but it's a great poem and an absolutely wonderful commentary that you made on it. I mean, this is a book of discoveries, I think.
Thanks. I'll just say about that poem, it's very rare in the history of war poetry for someone to mourn for the dead on both sides of a fight.
Yeah.
You practically have to go back to Propertius for this to happen.
Yeah. Whitman did it.
Yeah.
Whitman did it too. Hi, John. Do we are there any questions?
I think we just have one question. I think that's a really wonderful place to end on too. But there's just one quick question here. You both warned me before we went live that you could talk to each other for hours. I want to let you. I'm inclined to do so. I think everyone here is as wrapped as I am and would like you to start a podcast where you just talk about poetry with each other. But our friend, the poet Keith Taylor, has a question for you, Charles. He says, "You got to tell us, Charlie, where did Ed's enthusiasm fail? I'll look it up tomorrow."
Okay.
You brought it up. I'm interested.
Yeah. So something like 20 or 30 years ago, there was a PBS series on American poets. And it was kind of wonderful. And one of the poets that they studied was Hart Crane. And in the Hart Crane show, one of the people they interviewed was Richard Howard. And Richard Howard said about Hart Crane, he clearly admired him, maybe not as much as Derek Walcott did, but clearly admired him, but said, when I read Hart Crane's work, I think that he was often distracted. I remember that word that Richard used, that he was distracted. And when I was in college, I loved Hart Crane. I loved The Bridge. And I don't love it as much anymore as I once did. Those great, sweeping, rhetorical structures that take you away. And what you say about Hart Crane and about the invocation is very telling. It's very smart, but I can see that there are some reservations that you are not saying. I know you.
I'd say you're expressing your own reservations. I mean, this is more about, I think, Keith, thank you. Charlie's telling us a lot about himself here, less about me. But it is true that what I actually love is Hart Crane's project. And I love Hart Crane trying
but that's very different. That's very different.
And I love his trying to overthrow T.S. Eliot and the way he tried to make an optimistic American vision. But it's true that what happens to Crane is that he can't sustain it. He keeps trying to sustain the sublime mode at the highest pitch, and he keeps breaking down. And so, I mean, look, let's face it, he's not a thinker. He's not a thinker. The ear is incredible, and sometimes he doesn't know what he's saying.
Yeah.
The invocation is about as tight as it could be, I'd say, as one of Hart Crane's poems.
Yeah.
But
Do you remember the Hart Crane line I used to quote to you whenever we came out of committee meetings at Wayne State University?
no, what was it?
You know,
No.
we make our meek adjustments.
No.
We make our meek adjustments. It's from a great Hart Crane poem called Chaplain-esque.
Yeah, it's about the cat, right?
Yeah.
It's really okay. Yeah, point taken, Charlie. Point taken. But Hart Crane is incredibly important in the firmament. There's a sort of about 50 or 60 pages where I talk about William Carlos Williams, Hart Crane, Theodore Retki, and their response to T.S. Eliot.
Yeah.
And their attempt to make an affirmative American vision in response to the wasteland. Right. And Crane is, Williams is closer to my personal temperament.
Mine too.
But Crane is an important extension of the high romantic mode to try and create a sublime American poetry.
Yeah.
That was a wicked question, Keith.
Thank you, Keith. Thank you, Keith.
But it brought us to such a beautiful place. So thank you, Edward Hirsch and Charles Baxter, for joining us on At Home with Literati this evening. You can buy The Heart of American Poetry. There's a link in the chat if you're watching us. On YouTube, there's links to purchase books from Literati Bookstore directly in the description below me. Charlie and Ed, we'd love to have you in the store in the not too distant future to do this again.
Thanks, John. Love being with you.
Yeah,
you're just doing great. The Lord's work there, so it's really thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you, John. Thank you
guys
so much.
You make it incredibly easy, so please let's do it again. But until then, take care, and to all of our viewers, thanks for joining us. Have a great night, everybody. Take care.
All right, thank you.